welcome. Thanks for being here, and thank you to our hosts, ENACT, Sandy, and Traffic for bringing us together. Fantastic venue, extremely beautiful. And my name is Ronak Gopaldas. I am an ENACT and had a bit of a chuckle to myself because as someone approaching the age of 40, nothing quite says I'm officially entering middle age and my geriatric millennial era like spending the morning discussing plants and exotic pets. But here we are delving into two F words, fauna and flora, and discussing succulents and exotic pets. So Stug Life chose me. So I'm sure like many of you plant parents, my biggest worry in the past has been keeping my houseplants alive. But it turns out there's an entire underground world of smuggling and illicit wildlife trading to contend with. Trafficking in rare plants and reptiles is not only surprising, but it also poses a serious threat to biodiversity, ecosystems, and livelihoods across Southern Africa. So my role today is to facilitate this discussion. We're going to hear from the experts. I'm going to really kind of, before we kick off the discussion, frame this in three parts. So one, give you some context around what ENACT does. Two, paint the picture around what is currently going on in Southern Africa in terms of this illegal trading and trafficking, and then kind of give you a sense of what we are looking to get out of the discussion. So for those of you who don't know, ENACT is dedicated to enhancing Africa's response to transnational organized crime. The project is implemented by the Institute of Security Studies in partnership with Interpol and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. ENACT has staff across Africa, and its key stakeholders include government departments, regional organizations, non-governmental organizations, academics, and civil society. And the work of ENACT focuses really on two key interventions. First, to provide an evidence base of transnational organized crime in Africa. And second, to support key stakeholders to enhance their ability to mitigate transnational organized crime by assisting them with capacity building and technical expertise. Now, in terms of what we're currently seeing in the Southern Africa region, which is the region we'll be discussing today, I think for everyone, they're quite aware of the illegal trade in rhinos and pangolins, but very few are familiar with the illegal trade in some of Southern Africa's rarest plants and reptiles. The illegal wildlife trade in both flora and fauna is said to be the fourth largest illicit market in the world, valued between 7 and 23 billion US dollars. And often intersects with other organized crime markets, including the illegal harvesting of species being targeted has evolving up online and in marketplaces on the other side of the globe. South Africa is therefore not suffering alone, and this is both a regional and a continental scourge. On the other hand, the exotic pet trade is a global multi-million-dollar phenomenon, driving unsustainable species harvesting, resulting in some of these species becoming critically endangered, and South Africa plays exotic pet trade as both an importer and an exporter. South Africa is home to 400 reptile species, and between 2013 and 2020, at least 4,500 exotic and indigenous reptiles were exported from South Africa. 80% of these reptiles are native species. Like plant succulents, the Northern and Western Cape are affected by wild reptile collecting to supply the exotic pet trade. Now, this growing international reptile trade is mostly unregulated and often unlawful, and the data is unreliable because many of the species are not CITES listed, and most countries don't keep records of these unlisted species. As is usually the case with most forms of illegal wildlife trade as well, the market for these plants is situated abroad, including the US, Asia, and Europe. So whilst the focus is often on local harvesters, the market is run by a combination of both local and international criminal network members from source to consumer. These networks include criminal actors, but may include state-embedded actors and private sector actors as well. So that's the picture of kind of what we're dealing with. What do we want to get out of the discussion? Well, really what we want to do is one, explore the current context. Two, look at the responses to preventing and combating this illegal trade, which includes intelligence analysis, collaboration, and the use of technology. And then to give you a full and holistic picture of the plight of those who work tirelessly on this issue on the front lines. So the hope is that you'll leave this seminar with a new appreciation for this biodiversity around you, and that you'll interrogate where your plant and reptiles purchases come from, and will spread the word about the issues that we're currently grappling with. So that is the broad context. Before we kick off with the panel of experts, I'd like to call Louis up to give us some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Ronak. Good morning. My name is Louis Day from the European Union. I work for something called the Global Transregional Threats Program of the EU, which funds the ENACT project, which has brought us together here today. Now, as Ronak has mentioned, the ENACT project is implemented by ISS, GTOC, and Interpol, all of whom are represented here today. Well, I won't go into details about the project since Ronak has already described it, but I'd also like to welcome a representative of Traffic, who is also going to participate in the discussions today. So, as Ronak mentioned, today we're going to hear about the work and research going into the illicit trade of succulents and reptiles within the Southern Africa region. And through the generous support of the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI, Ms. Emily Kudze will give us a tour of the botanical gardens to view some of the plants that have been seized in law enforcement operations. So, as Ronak mentioned, succulent plant trafficking has become a significant concern due to the high demand for rare and endemic species in international markets. SANBI estimates that around 1.5 million wild plants have been removed from the Succulent Karoo biome in South Africa since 2021. Reptile trafficking has also emerged as a serious environmental and conservation issue, yes, driven by the demand for exotic pets, not only in South Africa, but internationally as well. And a lot of this trade occurs in the online space, internet forums, online marketplaces. These are the major facilitators. And a lot of this is unregulated, with many of the species traded not being CITES listed, which makes data collection efforts more difficult. So, the session today is going to highlight the trends and challenges in these crimes, which threaten biodiversity here. And we will hear presentations on the context of South Africa in respect of these markets, the value of criminal intelligence analysis, encountering trafficking in plants and animals with lessons from Malawi's experience, a succulent poaching case study and how research and policy practice inform state and civil society action, and tracking online trade in reptiles, timber, and plants. And then this will be followed by a short discussion where we also hope to hear from the experts in the room about all your work and efforts to curb the illicit trade in plants and reptiles. So this event will try and showcase both the problems and solutions that have been successful and merit consideration in any future responses. I wish you productive discussions and thank you very much.
Thanks, Louis, for setting the scene there. I think we can now proceed to our first speaker, who is Dominique Prinsloo. She will not be joining us in person, but she has a pre-recorded message, which we will be sharing. Just some background before we play this recording. Dominique is a project manager at Traffic, wildlife trade monitoring network. She's worked on a variety of projects relating to wildlife conservation in Africa, legal and illegal wildlife trade, community-based natural resource management, protected area management, and transnational cooperation, and currently coordinates research projects at Traffic, including work on wildlife crime offender interviews and historical wildlife crime court case analyses, as well as illegal wildlife trade awareness workshops. So Dominique is going to give us an overview and some context around Southern Africa, and I think we are ready for that. Thanks.
Good day, everyone. My name is Dominique, and I work for an NGO called Traffic, which is the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you today, so I really hope you do enjoy this presentation that I have prepared, which will be talking about some of our results from our project called Harnessing Technology to End the Illegal Trade in Succulent Plants. This project has got 4 objectives, of which one of the objectives is to conduct research into the illegal trade in succulent plants that are being harvested illegally from Namibia and South Africa. So I'm going to give you some information from the results from our research about what we know so far about the illegal trade in succulent plants and other flowering plants coming from South Africa and Namibia specifically. The trade in plants for ornamental use has been going on for many, many years. At this point in time, our biggest concern is for succulent plants. So these are plants from the genus Aloe or Conophytum or Euphorbia and so on. Dwarf succulents from the genus Conophytum are of particular concern at the moment. Some other plants that are being used for ornamental reasons are caduciforms, which are essentially plants that form a caudex, which is either a swollen base or a swollen stem. And I'll show you pictures of these plants in the next few slides. So elephant's foot or Dioscorea elephantypes is one of these plants. We then have plants from other genera like Adenium, Cyphostemma, Euphorbia, Phocia, and Pachypodium. There's also a big trade in flowering plants, specifically the bulbs, from a genus called Bouffane. And then, of course, our cycads are still being traded at the moment. From the sources of demand, we essentially have 3 categories of the sources of demand for succulent plants. There's the general public, there's specialized collectors who know exactly which genus and species of plants they want, and then we have the commercial traders that are supplying the general public and specialized collectors with these plants. The source countries include many African countries. Our focus for this research is South Africa and Namibia, but what we're seeing online is that many plants are being harvested from the wild illegally from places like Madagascar, Malawi, and Tanzania. There's 2 types of demand that we have found. There's domestic demand, so that means that there are traders and buyers in South Africa for succulent plants. But most of the illegally harvested plants seem to be going outside of South Africa. So there's international demand in many continents like North America, Europe, and Asia, but we've got specific traders in China and Japan looking for the succulent plants that seem to be wild harvested from South Africa, such as the Western Cape and Northern Cape. We've also seen a change from how people are buying the plants. So a long time ago, you used to have to buy plants using physical catalogs and mail orders, but now you can pretty much get any plant online. So social media has definitely facilitated this. We can see adverts for plants on sale on Instagram, Facebook through marketplace or profiles, as well as things like WeChat, which is used in Asia. E-commerce websites such as eBay and Etsy allow the sale of plants and seeds. And we've also seen plants available for auction on eBay and Facebook. On the screen, you will see adverts from profiles on Instagram. These are photographs and posts of plants from Southern Africa that are for sale and potted in Japan. So I'll tell you the plants from the left to the right. The first two plants that you can see, the first one is from the species Dioscorea elephantypes, which is the elephant's foot. It's got a swollen round base, and it kind of has a vine-like stem protruding from the top of the plant. Next to it is a species from the genus Bufane. It's known as gifbol in Afrikaans. On the next image, there's a variety of species. There's Euphorbia obesa, there's some Pelargonium, there's also another elephant's foot with a vine shaped in a round circle. And then next to it, we have also a variety of species that are from genera such as, I think there's Pelargonium and there's Adenium as well. And then lastly, there's a cycad on the far right. These are screenshots of an Instagram profile, specifically the stories that they've uploaded and pinned to their profile. This is a species of plant from the genus Operculicaria. It's being harvested illegally in Madagascar, and on the right-hand side, you can see it's been packed for shipping and sent over to Japan. It was also being advertised for sale along with CITES 1 Madagascar tortoises. CITES 1 Madagascar tortoises are not allowed to be traded internationally. That's what happens if a species is listed on CITES 1. This profile happened to be a public profile, so anyone could log onto it and see these screenshots. Navigating social media is extremely tricky. Not only are there hundreds and thousands of profiles, posts, hashtags, and groups, some of these profiles and groups are set to public or private, and therefore it is difficult to navigate private groups if you are not accepted as a member to join. So remember, for every post that is made, someone could put a hashtag linking to another post, and what we're seeing is just essentially hundreds and thousands of posts of succulent plants. Essentially, some of these are just posts of plants that people have and are sharing the progress and how they've grown and what they look like. Otherwise, some of these are actual adverts for plants. And I'll show you an advert for something on the next slide. So these are screenshots of posts from Facebook. On the left-hand side is the plant Cyphostemma uta, which is native to Namibia, and this is what it looks like in the wild. On the right-hand side is a trader selling this plant for sale. It's highly likely that this plant was harvested illegally from the wild. Many succulents take a very, very long time to grow to this size, and so it's very unlikely that Cyphostemma uta would have been grown in captivity over the last 20 to 30 years in order to reach this size. And so this is what we're seeing online. Given the fact that we are not a law enforcement agency, we do submit profile names and any evidence that we find to DFFE and other law enforcement agencies in the relevant countries so that they can conduct an investigation and take this further. As I mentioned earlier, it's not only succulents that are being harvested illegally from the wild en masse. This is a Facebook marketplace post for clivia plants. I'm sure many of you have got clivias in your garden. And in general, you can buy clivias legally from nurseries and online. However, what we're seeing in the Eastern Cape is that clivia plants are being harvested illegally from the wild. South Africa's got 5 species of clivia plants, which are all native to South Africa. And it seems like it's much easier to access these plants in the wild than to put the investment in growing them themselves. And we see these plants appear online quite a bit. It's difficult to tell wild harvested clivia from clivia that are being artificially propagated. But in the profile on the right, this person was selling both clivia species as well as Cyphostemma uta, which we know is from Namibia and also protected in Namibia. So if we have enough motivation to suspect that these plants are illegally harvested, we submit the profile to law enforcement to take this further. And hopefully they continue with an investigation into these plants. But as you can see, you can clearly access plants from many social media platforms all over. And chances are some of the rarest species are illegally harvested from the wild. Many platforms or websites of nurseries seem to hold WhatsApp group sales. So what happens is they'll share a newsletter or a post on Facebook saying they're having a WhatsApp sale at this specific time, and what you do is you join the link and you join the group, and these are the kind of things that offer sales. So photos of plants indicating the quantity and the price, the species, and exactly if you'd like to place an order, you simply reply and say mine or bought or the quantity that you'd like. There are many plants for sale that are possibly protected under the domestic ordinance, which is fine as long as the nurseries have got the right permits or proof of origin or any kind of certificate that states where they obtained the plant. Most of these sales should be fine. I've yet to see, for example, protected species like conophytums for sale locally on WhatsApp. However, I wouldn't be surprised if this starts popping up soon. And so it would be really important to make sure law enforcement are aware that many of these WhatsApp sales are actually to address local demand. So for example, this plant Anacampsaris, it is listed on CITES, so someone would not be able to trade in this internationally unless they have a specific permit, and there are specific exceptions that allow you to trade in this plant internationally. A popular question that we get asked is what led to an increased demand in succulent plants and rare plants and flowering plants over the last 10 years. During my interviews, I've collected a bunch of evidence that point towards some of the reasons behind this. One of the interviewees mentioned South Africa's 2015-2016 drought, where there was basically a massive promotion of drought-tolerant plants or desert plants for water-wise gardens. And essentially those are many plants coming from the Western and Northern Cape provinces. COVID-19 is often mentioned as a key point in time where the trade in plants either increased and the modus operandi around how these plants were harvested changed. So what we know from COVID-19 is that obviously we went through a period where there were lockdowns. So not only was there sort of international lockdowns preventing travel, there was also national and local lockdowns, which essentially deprived people of freely visiting open green spaces. So if you didn't have the luxury of a garden, you were pretty confined to your flat, which we don't realize huge populations of people live in flats without access to these green spaces. And urban green spaces are known to play a key role in your well-being. And so the increased demand in ornamental plants for decorative, aesthetic reasons, as well as mental health, we saw that happen during the lockdown. And also many different houseplants have become extremely trendy, and COVID-19 intensified this trend. So what would have been a casual interest in plants for many people maybe became a hobby while they were stuck at home. And then obviously COVID-19 had a big effect on our economy. We know now that South Africa's economy has taken a major hit because of COVID and is struggling to recover. And we know that during this time there was increased poverty due to loss of income. What we're seeing with the trade in succulent plants is that there's definitely convergence with other crimes, commodities, and roots. So as with all wildlife crime, corruption and bribery are huge issues that facilitate this trade and undermine law enforcement's efforts to try and contain this trade. We think that the succulent trade became so organized so quickly because the abalone and drug trades from the Western and Northern Cape provinces were already established. So essentially, the succulents that are coming from the Northern Cape and the Western Cape are heading to major centers, and instead of being paid in money, people are being paid in drugs, and hence the convergence with these crimes. And really, the combination of unfavorable circumstances above have led to a perfect storm for the current threatening situation that we have. I just wanted to show you a map of the cases involving succulent plants according to the towns in which the cases were registered in the Northern and Western Cape provinces. I'm sure my counterparts at SANB will go into some of the modus operandi of some of these cases and some of the quantities of seizures of the plants that they've had. But as you can see, the Northern Cape and Western Cape, the biggest cases, so the density of cases that have been recorded are in areas like Springbok and Garies. And obviously we're seeing quite high numbers going all the way down to the Western Cape coast. The Eastern Cape is quite data deficient at the moment. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of the removal of plants, specifically for medicinal use, but little is known about what's happening in the Eastern Cape when it comes to the utilization and illegal harvest of succulent plants. As you can see, the cases just have continued since 2022. Even with 2023's data, there are seizures regularly along the main roads, and unfortunately, our law enforcement are seeing just a massive number of cases coming through at regular intervals. We've come to the end of my presentation. Many of the results that you see now will be collated into a report that we hope to publish early next year. We are working with Kew Gardens on a web scraper to assist with all of these adverts that we're finding online. So I hope to have more concrete results in the near future. If you'd like to find out anything or contact me for any further information, you can reach me at dominique.prinsloo@traffic.org. Thank you for your time, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.
Thank you to Dominique in her absence. I think she painted a very clear and comprehensive picture for us around what we're dealing with. We're going to shift gears a little bit now and learn some lessons from Malawi. We are very, very privileged to have Andrew Kachere join us. Andrew is with the Malawi Police Service and has extensive experience on criminal markets and networks in the East and Southern African region, drawing on his years of experience in the police service. He is the head of the Malawi Criminal Intelligence Analytical Unit, which is an Interpol ENACT initiative aimed at building African policing capacity by supporting investigations, fostering law enforcement collaboration, and providing access to Interpol software and databases. Now, Andrew is going to talk to us about the value of criminal intelligence analysis, specifically with reference to trafficking in plants and animals. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, the moderator, for having me. As you heard, my name is Andrew Kachere, the head of Criminal Analytical Unit in Malawi. And I'm going to share with you this morning on our experiences in trafficking of plants and animals, especially focusing on these wildlife crimes in Malawi. So, Malawi is geographically positioned in the middle of a regional wildlife poaching hotspot. And as we are all aware that Malawi borders Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, where within these three respective bordering countries are protected areas, which are also listed as the focal points for poaching. And in terms of Malawi, it has about 133 protected areas, which are covering about 27,190 square kilometers. So Malawi is not only a source of illicit wildlife products, but also a collection, distribution, and a transit hub for wildlife trafficking. And the wildlife crimes in Malawi are being driven by lucrative illegal markets, which are utilized by international criminal syndicates. So these criminal networks have been responsible for coordinating trade in wildlife products. such as ivory, lion, horns, pangolins, forest produce, such as timbers. So, in terms of the major flaws of environmental crimes, Malawi has wildlife trafficking as one of the major flaws, illegal mining, illegal fishing, and illegal logging. So wildlife trafficking involves the illegal trade of endangered species and their parts, such as already mentioned, ivory, lion horns, pangolins, hippo teeth. But at the same time, Malawi is also experiencing unregulated gold mining and extraction of other valuable minerals. In terms of illegal fishing, there's a wide range of aquatic ecosystems in Malawi, which include rivers, lakes, streams, dams, marshes, and the swamps. So these water bodies hold a huge diversity of fish fauna and the other aquatic fauna and flora. As such, the illegal fishing activities in Malawi pose a significant threat to the biodiversity and conservation efforts. So the endangered fish species that inhabit in the protected areas are already under pressure from the overfishing, deforestation, and climate change. And above all, illegal fishing only exacerbates the already problem that is there. So in terms of illegal logging, Malawi has also a problem. Malawi has also a problem. And there are two scenarios whereby we have small-scale logging, whereby local communities surrounding the forest often engage in illegal logging due to economic necessity. As such, they cut down trees for firewood, charcoal production, and small-scale timbers, since wood is primary source of energy for most of the households in the rural Malawi. But there is also another scenario whereby we have organized criminal networks which are involved in this illegal activity. So these are larger criminal syndicates operating in the forest, often with links to local elites and some corrupt officials. These organized networks have been involved in the illegal harvesting and exportation of high-value timbers that are often transported across the borders. So that's the major environmental crimes that Malawi is faced with. And in terms of the status of wildlife crimes in Malawi, as I said, wildlife crimes continue to present a serious threat to survival of plants, animals, including elephants, rhinos, pangolin. So the trade in specimens of these accounts for the variety of major wildlife crimes in Malawi. Now, under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, amended in 2017, there are three groups of species that are protected. We have the endangered species, protected species, and the listed species. So the trade of pangolin in Malawi remains small in comparison with some other African countries. But of recent, these pangolin cases have exceeded the elephant cases. So, however, the details about the pangolin trade in Malawi requires further investigation and analysis, since it is almost entirely in live animals and not the scales. So from the charts, just an overview of the trends for the past three years, whereby we have the number of elephant-related cases which have fallen, and in 23, there was a further decline down only to 28 individual cases. If you look on the middle chart, is showing the pangolin cases, which has outnumbered the elephant-related cases in 2021. And this trend continued through to 2023, where pangolin cases were a bit down by 50% compared to 2021 peak. And the lino cases remained low and stable. So out of the about 290 listed species cases in 2021, between 2021 and 2023, 60% of these cases were related to pangolin cases. If you look at the nationality of suspects that have been involved in much of these world trafficking crimes, we see that the involvement of non-Malawian actor nationals, African nationals, was low over the period between 2021 and 2023, generally fewer than 10 individuals. So this reflects the arrest of the much taught Ling Zhang syndicate, which was one of the most powerful syndicates in the southern region, southern part of Africa. So this reflects that the arrest of this syndicate, which was mainly composed of the Chinese national, brought an impact in the number of foreign nationals involved in wildlife trafficking cases in Malawi. So the syndicate, the disruption, the conviction of these syndicate criminals, disrupted that network. And if we look at the gender perspective, find that 95% of the suspects predominantly were men across all the types of cases and across the years, with women making up only about 5% of those individuals arrested. In terms of seizures, I'm happy to report that I think no major international seizure linked to Malawi for the past 3 or so years, since the 2017 international seizure was registered. So the illegal export of wildlife products through Malawi, Malawi's international airports, has become almost impossible. And this is due to the improved law enforcement efforts that have been implemented. Now, let me just talk about the criminal intelligence analysis. What impact has it on the wildlife crimes in Malawi? So as criminal intelligence analysis unit, we have sought to bring the criminal analysis techniques to bear on investigation and enable more effective understanding of wildlife crimes in Malawi. So through the crime analysis coupled with the investigations, we have identified organized criminal networks whose activities have been focused on the environmental crimes, especially trafficking of wildlife products, that's including plants and animals. So this has been done by studying the wildlife criminal data in order to identify the trends, patterns, and the relationship between a variety of criminals and the crime types. So in general, the analytical products that we have produced sought to provide integrated criminal analysis in supporting operations and the strategic approach to wildlife crime management. So we have seen the exposure of syndicates, which involved foreign nationals, especially from our neighboring countries, and again from China, as the main key actors in this illegal wildlife trade. We have also noted the involvement of women in these wildlife crimes, especially poaching, illegal possession.
Politics of 7 or 8, like 6, 7, 8.
And trafficking. So some of the wildlife species that have been seized in Malawi have crossed the borders from our neighboring countries. Since, as I said, Malawi is also a transit country of wildlife crimes. So in terms of what drivers are there for wildlife crimes in Malawi, one, we have corruption. Corruption within the law enforcement and the other government sectors allows wildlife to flourish by enabling the criminals to evade detection, arrest, prosecution, and punishment. As such, crime syndicates involved in wildlife trafficking bribes law enforcement agencies for them to undertake their criminal activities with impunity. Another enabler, major enabler that we also identified is the compromised borders. Malawi and the neighboring countries have a huge landmass with long borders, which are difficult to safeguard and police. As such, these spaces have become safe havens and corridors for the smuggling and trafficking of wildlife products. Poverty, again, is playing a role in these wildlife crimes, because some people end up engaging in criminal activities as a way of earning a living and means of survival. So unemployment and the poverty levels drive many people to engage in illegal wildlife trade or poaching as a means of livelihood. The other enabler that we have identified is a lack of cooperation among some of the member states, is compromising the effort to combat organized crime in the region, including the wildlife crimes. So this has been experienced from the challenges in information sharing and the multiple jurisdiction investigations. What are the lessons that we have learned? One of the major lessons, which is also very important for Malawi, is that of the robust legal framework, which are essential in the fight against wildlife crimes. Therefore, strong laws coupled with effective enforcement can serve as deterrent to wildlife criminals. As I said, in 2017, we had a National Parks and Wildlife Act, which was amended, and is imposing stiffer punishment on the perpetrators, whereby someone can be convicted up to 30 years in prison without the option of fine. So that has acted as a deterrent. But again, collaboration between government agencies, international and governmental organizations, and local communities has been also key to success in Malawi. Partnering with organizations has bolstered both expertise, investigation, and prosecution efforts, demonstrating that public-private partnerships can lead to substantial improvements in wildlife crime fight. It has also shown that it is crucial to involve the local communities that are close to the protected areas, because the financial motivation to poaching is lessened by the programs that can be offered as an alternative to livelihoods, and the community support is essential for the long-term preservation of wildlife. Another lesson that we have learned is the law of regional and international collaboration. That is so critical. Intelligence gathering and analysis also, it is very critical in as far as fighting the transnational organized crime, such as wildlife crimes. So in conclusion, Malawi has successfully fought the battle, and it is still fighting with the support of other partners, with the collaboration of other stakeholders, again coupled with the strong laws and the enforcement efforts that have been put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for a presentation that was very insightful and very rich in data. We've had two quite different and diverse presentations, and as we kind of begin to understand what we're dealing with more holistically, we're gonna, if you'll excuse the pun, go a little bit deeper into the weeds now. We have got Karina Brewer, a senior researcher from ISS ENACT, who has done a case study on succulent poaching, and she'll be presenting some reflections on that, on the impact of her research, and how it is going to inform state and civil society action. Some context and some background around Karina. She's a senior researcher with ENACT, where research focuses on Southern Africa and parts of Eastern Africa. She's an admitted attorney and has worked for the Endangered Wildlife Trust and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime Global Maritime Crime Program. She's conducted research and written on illegal trade of succulents in Southern Africa and South Africa, and her work focuses on policy and governance responses to illicit markets in Africa. Karina, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see so many of the stakeholders here today, but I feel like I should apologize for having to sit through my presentation probably for the third or fourth time for some of you. But for everyone else, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present on my research. So I published a report on the illegal succulent market, focusing specifically on the demand for South African succulents in November of last year. So I will focus on the illegal market briefly, as well as on the report, but I really want to highlight the role that stakeholders played in generating the data for the report and some of the very, I think, productive outputs that were the result of this research report. So I'll start with giving an overview of the illegal market. Dominique has done a great job of giving an overview. I'll go into a little bit more detail. Then I will look at an overview of the research project and the report that was produced. And then I'll highlight some of the engagement that we have with stakeholders. So, as I've noted, the report focused specifically on South African species, but it definitely could have focused on Namibian species as well, because there is this cross-border targeting of species in the arid regions. So, these plants are in demand, primarily internationally, but there are parallel trades. So, there is a legal trade and an illegal trade. And the reason why these plants are in demand is because they are beautiful, they're unique, they're interesting. And so unlike plants that are targeted, for example, for medicinal purposes, these are targeted because of the way that they look. So as I've noted, there's a legal and illegal market. The legal market is supplied by nurseries, both locally and abroad, although primarily nurseries based abroad. And they artificially propagate plants that are then offered for sale, whereas the illegal market is primarily supplied or exclusively supplied by wild harvested plants that have been taken out of their natural habitat without the necessary permit. So, of course, in violation of national laws. The challenge that this illegal market has had is that it's not just the targeting of one or two species. So multiple species have been targeted. At the time that the report was published, over 650 species had been seized, which is a massive number. And over 1 million plants had been seized. So the volume of the plants being traded is really quite large. These plants are targeted in a specific area that's known as the Succulent Karoo region. The challenge that we have with protecting the plants in situ or in their natural habitat is the fact that they occur over this vast area. So the Succulent Karoo covers the Western, the Northern, and the Eastern Cape. On that map, you'll see it's the sort of lime green coloring. And of course, the plants also occur across the border in Namibia. So if we want to protect these plants, they really do need to protect a very large area where they occur. A lot of the areas in the region of the Succulent Karoo are very remote. They're sparsely populated, so we also don't have a lot of people on the ground who can monitor plants or who know what's going on or who can see when there's an incursion onto property. These plants are targeted not only on private land or in protected areas, they are targeted on communal land. So I don't know who of you know, but a lot of the land in Namaqualand or in the Northern Cape is communal land. And so it's also challenging to address the plants that are targeted there. And then why are the wild plants targeted? I think Dominique gave a good overview of that, but I think it's safe to say that they were targeted because whatever was in demand was not available in legal supply. And so that's why we saw this increase in the illegal market. So I thought it would be good to just highlight the Succulent Karoo, especially for those who aren't perhaps familiar with it. I've been lucky enough to visit it multiple times, and I was there again this weekend. It really is a magnificent part of the country. But it's a very important part of South Africa in that it's the most biodiverse arid region globally. So yes, it looks dry and desolate, but there's so much life there, and I think it's evidenced by all of the succulents and the plants that occur there. But as I've mentioned, it's a massive area. It covers over 100,000 square kilometers. So because of the arid environment and the unique features of the region, there's a high rate of endemicity, which means that many of the plants, about 40% of the plants that occur in the Succulent Karoo are found only there. That means that if they disappear there, they won't be found anywhere else. And if they're gone from there, they're gone everywhere. As I've noted, this area is massive. It's sparsely populated, so there's not a lot of human presence. And I think this is a good example of the role that geography and geology plays in the kind of wildlife crimes that we see taking place in specific settings. As I've mentioned, I focused on succulent plants in the Succulent Karoo, but as Dominique has mentioned, other areas are also targeted, and other countries as well. So how does the market operate? During my interviews, it was quite interesting where a lot of people equated the operation of the illegal succulent market with the operation of the illegal abalone market. So it's quite similar, and there are even links with those, the networks who are operating both of these. So it really mimics other illegal wildlife markets, specifically if you consider that demand is based primarily abroad. We have a variety of harvesters who initially start out perhaps opportunistically and eventually become quite organized. We see how once the plants have been harvested in the Succulent Karoo region, they are moved to intermediaries that are based in urban centers, so specifically Cape Town and Johannesburg. And then from there, these plants are moved out of the country, sometimes directly from South Africa, other times through our neighboring countries or regional countries. And Tanzania seems to play a very central role in the export of plants from the African continent. As I've mentioned, some of these transnational networks that run the market are also involved in other illegal commodities. So we've mentioned abalone, some of them have been linked to drugs and the trade of rhino horn. And then like any other illegal market, it's facilitated by corruption. The two go hand in hand. If you look at the International Convention on Organized Crime, it also mentions corruption specifically. And so it's no surprise that the succulent market is also facilitated by corruption. We see how this market exploits legitimate supply chains. So it's moving along with legal goods globally, often by air using courier companies. So next to your parcel from Take-A-Lot, there could be a parcel with succulents on its way somewhere else. So really we see multinational and legitimate companies also being used to facilitate the market. And then as Dominique has mentioned, it's very much been influenced by globalization and online marketplaces. So people not only now are more aware of the plants that are available, but they're also now able to get a plant from the other side of the world within a few days. So what has the impact been? Of course, the primary impact has been on the environment. So many species, or the illegal trade prompted species assessments. And so we saw from those assessments that many species have disappeared. So some are now endangered, some are critically endangered, and unfortunately, a few species are even now functionally extinct. So that means there might be a few left in their natural habitat, but it's not enough for the population to be viable to reproduce. We've also know that, as I've mentioned, over 1 million plants have been seized. But unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of those seized plants might have been prevented from entering the legal trade, but they still have died because there simply aren't the necessary resources to look after them, and they can't be returned to the wild yet. The second impact is on the responders. It was quite eye-opening to speak to all of the stakeholders and to hear the impact that this illegal market has had on them, because they've basically gone from having a normal day job to having to full-time focus on this illegal trade, which was never part of the plan. So they have to deal with massive amounts of plant material with very limited resources. And we have amazing plant expertise in South Africa, but the expertise are still not enough, for example, to write court statements for people to attend court. So it really has had a big impact on the responders. Of course, there's an impact on the surrounding communities. So the harvesters typically come from regions or communities around where these plants are found. And so a lot of these people have been apprehended and arrested, so because they were enticed to illegally harvest. And so we see the impact of people being arrested, being prosecuted, the impact on their families, and of course the typical ills that come with illegal markets. Another impact is on nurseries. I spoke to a few nursery owners, and a lot of them noted the impact that the illegal market has had on the legal trade. So they can see that some of the species that they were trading in previously, that numbers went massively down. A lot of the nurseries have stopped trading in plants, but have decided to instead just trade in seeds as a result. And some have decided that they might not even want to continue with their business. And then, of course, there's also been a broader impact on the economy as the state can't generate revenue from the illegal trade. So I'm just taking a sip of water. So although I've been talking about the Succulent Karoo species, Leon, I'll give you a photos. We should really remember that this is not an isolated thing. We shouldn't just be looking at it by itself. So yes, the report and a lot of our research is focused on the Western Cape and the Northern Cape, but as Dom has mentioned, a lot is happening in the Eastern Cape that we just, I don't think, have even scraped the surface of. We've spoken about South Africa, but really this is a Southern African problem. We've recently met with our colleagues in Namibia. They have the same problems. We know that massive amounts of plants are leaving Madagascar. If we think it's bad here, it's probably worse there. And the possibilities are endless. I think at the previous meeting we had someone mention even Somali plants popping up on these websites. So we've spoken about succulents, but it's not only succulent plants, it's also clivias, as shown in these pictures, where a very rare species of clivia has been targeted in a protected area, and there aren't many of them, which means that the harvesting is having a severe impact on the remaining population. And it's not only plants. So I've mentioned how these markets converge, so people running the plant markets are also running other markets. When I had some of my interviews in the Northern Cape especially, a lot of people mentioned the issue of reptile trafficking. So the Northern and Western Cape is also home to very unique species of tortoises, of very, very amazing lizards, even snakes. And many of these species are popping up on websites in Germany and Europe, despite the fact that legal trade is not allowed. And then I think the media often focuses on the sort of poacher narratives because we're in South Africa, this is where the supply is coming from. But we really should remember that these are transnational organized crimes. And a lot of it is facilitated by international professional people who are part of multinational companies. So if we look at some of the nurseries abroad that are selling some of these plants, these are nothing other than multinationals. So really to try and not just focus on the poaching narrative. So as I've mentioned, I then explored, had interviews with the stakeholders and then drafted the report on the illegal succulent market. So Dominique and Traffic have done an amazing study on the species and the trade itself. And David, who is here from Traffic, did a study in 1998, identifying the key species in trade. And they've done a sort of follow-up in that. So my report did not focus on the species being traded. My report focused specifically on the response strategy that was developed as this illegal market escalated very quickly. So that was the focus. So the strategy that was developed for the succulents is called the National Response Strategy and Action Plan to address the illegal trade in South African succulent flora. So the strategy was finalized in 2022, which was about 2 years after everyone realized that this market is really escalating very quickly. And I think this is quite a remarkably short amount of time for a strategy like this to be developed and also to be implemented, which is something that I think is very encouraging. So the strategy was developed in partnership by government departments and NGOs, primarily led by the South African National Biodiversity Institute, or SANBI. And so you'll see when we look at the specific objectives that a lot of the work was done in conjunction with NGOs and state stakeholders. And I will look at that in more detail now. But so the key aims of the strategy was, first of all, I wanted to provide an overview of the illegal market. Second of all, I considered the practical implementation of the National Succulent Strategy's 7 objectives. And then finally, I presented insights from stakeholders on how to optimize the implementation of the response. So I basically went to the stakeholders and said, you've got this amazing plan and strategy, what do you need to actually make it work? So just to highlight who some of the stakeholders are, I've already mentioned SANBI, the provincial conservation departments like Cape Nature and Darrell from the Northern Cape have been very key. We worked with SANParks, SAPS in the Western and Northern Cape provinces, the National Department of Forestries, Fisheries and Environment, the NPA, the prosecuting authority, nursery owners, and then multiple NGOs, without who this response would have been very, very limited, because often NGOs have the resources while the state has the mandate. So this is just to show you what the 7 objectives are. I will very briefly just look at each of them individually. But so in the strategy, you'll see on the right, what the strategy did, it has its 7 objectives, and then each objective has sub-actions, which made it very easy to identify who the stakeholders are, because each activity has been delegated to a specific stakeholder to implement. So it was very easy to identify who I should speak to, what the responsibility is, and what they need to actually do their job. So before I go into the objectives individually, I'm just going to highlight some of the key themes that came from stakeholders during my interviews. So the first one, and I've alluded to this already, was how important the cooperation between state and non-state stakeholders has been in the response. And this is, as I've mentioned, because there really is a limited amount of resources to implement the strategy. And so the cooperation between the state departments and NGOs have been invaluable, where the NGOs have been able to serve as a force multiplier effectively. So I've mentioned the succulent strategy, but South Africa also has a national integrated strategy to combat wildlife trafficking. So that's the overarching national strategy. But ironically, the national integrated strategy is focused primarily on only law enforcement and security. And that's where the succulent strategy very much improved on, because it has a holistic focus. So focusing on everything from the communities living around the plants to the demand on the other side of the globe. Unfortunately, it seems that the response has been primarily driven by the different provinces, so by the Western and the Northern Cape, and this is primarily due to a lack of resources from national government. We've seen that there's very limited law enforcement and resource capacity, especially considering how fast the illegal trade took off and how many plants are needing to be looked after. And this a lack of resources is especially acute in the Northern Cape. As I've noted, the responders noted a severe impact on them. These impacts stretch everywhere from they don't see their families anymore to mental health breakdowns. You name it, it's happened. The focus of the strategy, unfortunately, has been only in South Africa, which is completely understandable because that's where the base is. But part of that is the fact that the national and provincial legislation protecting these plants are not aligned. And so some of these plants are only protected provincially, which means that it's been very difficult to engage with international partners because what they're doing is not necessarily yet a crime. Then, because of the fact that these plants are only protected provincially, the interprovincial law enforcement cooperation has been absolutely vital, especially as plants cross the border from the Northern Cape into the Western Cape. As I've noted, the nurseries told me about the impact that the illegal market is having on the legal market. And then finally, although the national succulent strategy has a very holistic focus, a lot of people were saying that despite this, there's still very limited government departments who are actually tasked with implementing it. So typically when we see a response to wildlife criminal markets, this would be conservation entities and law enforcement entities. And you can't expect those entities to address the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to participation in these crimes in the first place. So I will very briefly go through the 7 objectives. I have a more detailed presentation that notes all of the recommendations and the challenges, and everything is in the report, which is available online. So I'm just going to go through the main sort of aims of the strategy. So the first one was to ensure the long-term survival of wild plants. So this is basically just to ensure that they aren't removed from the wild in the first place. And of course, some of the challenges with this was the fact that they occur in this vast area where you don't have permanent human presence. You can try out some different technologies, but technology, of course, is very expensive to monitor plants. And then the second part of this aim was to ensure that plants are actually monitored. So to know how many of a species there is, how big the population is, so that if there is illegal harvesting, you know what the impact on that species would be. The second objective of the strategy was to establish off-site succulent collections and to manage seized specimens. So I focused specifically on the management of seized specimens. And as I've noted, this was because hundreds and thousands of plants are being seized and they need to be housed and kept somewhere, which has been very difficult because you need tunnels to put these plants in, you need people who look after them, who have the expertise to look after them. And so one of the outflows of this objective was the development of SOPs to care for these plants, and also the donation by some NGOs of nursery equipment. Then the third objective aims to capacitate the compliance and the enforcement sector to be more effective against the illegal harvesting. So the compliance part is sort of aimed at the legal trade to ensure that those are trading legally, especially internationally, are complying with the laws and the permit conditions. And the second part is to look at law enforcement. So that's aimed primarily at the illegal market. So this includes the typical sort of law enforcement responses, like resourcing law enforcement departments by giving them more resources to, for example, patrol, putting up license plate recognition cameras. But it also includes more staff, which some of the entities have been able to allocate to the project, but not a lot of them have. So there's still quite a big lack in the number of staff members working on law enforcement. But then there's also been a lot of capacity building in terms of training, which I think has been really great. So you've seen training being done with everyone from investigators to customs officials to traffic departments to presiding officers, so judges and magistrates. They've been really, really successful in sensitizing them to the impact of the trade and to teach them about the conservation legislation that they would be applying. So one of the key recommendations for Objective 3 was to make sure that the law enforcement efforts are done also transnationally, and that's something that has been definitely improved since the report has come out. So there's now much more engagement with cross-border law enforcement entities, although this is still limited to the fact that these plants are not yet protected internationally. And so this is something that Objective 4 aims to address. So Objective 4 aims to streamline the regulatory frameworks to support the compliance and enforcement and to enhance sustainable use. So again, the aim of Objective 4 is twofold. It aims to make sure that the law is there to protect plants from illegal trade, but also to make sure that the law facilitates the legal trade or the sustainable use of these species. And so one of the key challenges that I've already mentioned is the fact that South Africa has concurrent national and provincial conservation legislation, which means that many of these plants are protected provincially in terms of provincial legislation, but they're not yet protected nationally in terms of national legislation. What that means is the second that a plant that's only protected in the Northern Cape or the Western Cape, the second that it leaves that province, it's not protected. And the same applies for the fact that these plants are not protected internationally. So some of them might be protected nationally, but the second that they leave South Africa, they're not protected internationally. So this is where CITES listings comes in. So one of the responses to the illegal market was the listing of some of the key species that are being targeted on CITES 3. But unfortunately, CITES 3 is not as enforceable as CITES 1 and 2 that requires import and export permits and allows you to not monitor the trade internationally. We also know that South Africa's protected species listings are out of date. They've not kept up with the species that are being targeted by illegal trade. And so one of the things that are being looked into is we have a new biodiversity bill that has a provision that could allow for emergency listings of species in the event that a trade like this escalates very quickly. Then the fifth objective aims to reduce the pressure on wild succulent populations by engaging local communities and facilitating the diversification of livelihoods. So of course, this is a very noble objective. It aims to address the root causes of why people are harvesting specifically in South Africa. And this is something that's also mentioned in the National Wildlife Trafficking Strategy, the need to address these root causes if you want the law enforcement response to also have a proper impact. But of course, as I've mentioned already, the strategy is implemented primarily by conservation and law enforcement entities. And so we need, for example, social development, the Department of Industry and Trade, to also come on board to really address the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to this. Then the second last objective is to effectively communicate the impact of the illegal market. So this is not only the aim to sort of have a communication strategy and to highlight the importance of protecting something as unique as the Succulent Karoo, but it also aims to sort of standardize certain messaging. So things like not advertising value of plants which aren't necessarily correct, that could inflate demand, not advertising where some of the seized specimens are being kept, not advertising where some of these plants are found, which is quite challenging because some of them are named after the place where they occur. But so that is a communication strategy that was developed, and that was done primarily by Sandby. And then the final objective is to explore options to develop a formal succulent economy. So the idea behind this is to make sure that you can use the legal trade to combat the illegal trade. And so nurseries, very much when I spoke to them, they pointed out that the foreign nurseries abroad have a monopoly on supplying our plants, artificially propagated plants. And so the idea with this objective would be to make sure that we can increase legal trade in South Africa so that the benefits can accrue back to South Africa. And this is where we came in with some of our stakeholder engagement. So before we came in, the WWF, the South African branch, did a study on different nursery models that could potentially be used to produce legally artificially cultivated plants. And then when I engaged with stakeholders, I asked them, is there any sort of workshop or format that you think would be helpful to get to push the strategy forward? And so they asked that we host a workshop on formal trade and seeking different options for using formal trade to increase supply from South Africa's side. And so we held a workshop in January here in Cape Town that was titled Towards Developing the Formal Economy Around South Africa's Succulent Flora. And so key things that came out during this workshop also came out in the report. And it's things like, it was quite, there are many bureaucratic processes that are currently impeding the legal trade. Nursery owners very much were saying what they would need from their side to increase their trade. They were saying because of the large amount of succulent plants that have been seized, they still can't use all of those plants. So things that we explored at this workshop were also how can we potentially use the seized plants to generate an income. These are the discussions that are ongoing. And then we also discussed potentially adding the ornamental succulent plants to South Africa's national biodiversity economy strategy, and to perhaps enter into access and benefit sharing agreements with countries where our plants are sold. So these are some of the things that have that were discussed at the workshop. I think that is more for Sanbi to share because they are the experts in that regard. And then finally, what was really cool to see, especially as a researcher, is when the strategy stakeholders had their meeting in September, they basically used the previous presentation that I had done to them to measure their progress. So some of our recommendations they used to measure their progress in achieving their goals, which I think was really, really good to see. And then we've also engaged with cross-border counterparts. So my current project, a different project, focuses on Namibia, and I was able there to meet with some of their representatives who are working on the plants in Namibia. They were very excited that South Africa has done research on the succulent plants, and they've subsequently also come to visit, organized by Sanbi and Traffic, to see how we can work together with the cross-border issues. So that is, in a summary, what the report did, what the outcomes were, and how it has helped to inform the actual implementation of strategies. Now I'm happy to take any questions a bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karina. I think that bottom-up analysis rooted in kind of real-world analysis really helped to complement what we've heard so far today. It was very practical and very helpful, so thank you for that. Our last speaker for today is Melissa Castleman, who is with GI. Melissa is an analyst with GI, as I mentioned, and she works as part of the EcoSolve team, the GI TOC's flagship environmental crime project. Melissa's efforts are focused on disrupting illicit wildlife trade in South Africa and globally by monitoring online wildlife trends and patterns and tracking flows. And that's what she will be speaking to us about today, tracking the online trade in reptiles, timber, and plants, and how this is going to influence a comprehensive stakeholder response. Melissa, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the warm introduction, Ronak. Sorry, I just want to skip this quickly. Okay. Good morning to everyone in the room and everyone who is joining us online today. So I'll be presenting on the online trade of reptiles and plants, which forms an integral part of a comprehensive stakeholder response. Much of the discussion this morning has been on plants, and we've touched the tip of the iceberg with regards to reptiles. But when we think of reptiles and plants, we don't really see much in common between them, especially when considering their physical attributes. But both plants and reptiles share a space in the criminal world right after neighboring other countries wildlife trade, a market that's considered the 4th largest in the world. Today I'll be sharing more about EcoSolve, which is a 3-year European Union funded project which seeks to tackle environmental crime, and it forms part of the Global Illicit Flows Program. I'll be looking at the prevalence of environmental crime in the region and how EcoSolve is designed to disrupt illicit flows within environmental crime. I'll also share some of the findings from the global monitoring system of EcoSolve and more about the trade of reptiles and plants in South Africa, including trafficking routes and case studies. To understand the levels of environmental crime in the Southern African region, I'd like to draw on the ENACT Organised Crime Index, which is a tool led by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. It measures the prevalence and impact of criminal markets, criminal actors, and the country's resilience to organised crime. And it does this for 193 member states of the United Nations. The tool considers 3 markets within environmental crimes, namely flora crimes, which include plant species like timber, orchids, and succulents; fauna crimes, which is the illegal trade of wildlife, both online and offline; and non-renewable resource crimes, which is the exploitation of natural resources and minerals. Since the inception of the tool in 2019, all 3 markets have experienced a sustained increase. Looking at fauna and flora crimes, more specifically for this discussion, we can see that fauna crimes are rampant in the Southern African region, which serves as one of the largest source hubs for live animals and animal parts for the world. South Africa, Botswana, and Mozambique are amongst the top spots in the region. The illicit trade of flora species has been identified as major issues in countries like South Africa, Namibia, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Zambia. The Organised Crime Index highlights the widening gap between organised crime and collective resilience efforts, and really shows the need for informed, practical strategies to combat not only environmental crime, but organised crime and other types of organised crime globally. EcoSolve is one such strategy, and it's designed to combat environmental crime by disrupting illicit environmental flows, by addressing limitations and gaps in past environmental interventions. So how exactly is EcoSolve designed? EcoSolve has 3 core work streams with a cross-cutting grant facility. 2 of the work streams focus on elite corruption and exposure and community engagement. This includes exposing corrupt relationships that enable illegal environmental commodity flows and holding community dialogues to improve law enforcement responses to environmental crimes. We are also running a grant program aimed at promoting data cooperation to disrupt illicit environmental flows. I won't be going into too much detail about this aspect of the EcoSolve project, but I'm mentioning them to give you a sense of the structure of the program. The largest component of the project is the 3rd work stream, which is our work on data, focusing largely on using key technologies and approaches to build new databases that will help detect crimes and support law enforcement action to disrupt illicit environmental flows. In order to do this within the 3rd work stream, we're developing a global monitoring system to monitor the illicit wildlife trade online, emphasizing the e-commerce and social media platforms that are used for marketing a select number of protected species. The global monitoring system serves several purposes. So by collecting relevant data, it can feed information into law enforcement action, and it also improves the evidence base for better policy making. The global monitoring system consists of several data hubs, each within a specific country. Currently, data hubs are operational in Brazil, South Africa, and Thailand, and we have partner hubs functioning in India and the United Arab Emirates. Data hubs are being added progressively throughout the project, and we'll have additional locations in the upcoming months and in 2025. The monitoring work of the data hubs is currently structured manually, but we're in the process of building an AI-enabled web scraper as part of the EcoSolve project, which will be used to detect illegal wildlife trade online. The role of the data hubs essentially is to bridge the gap between research efforts and law enforcement action by providing actionable intelligence developed through open source techniques in the form of detection packages to law enforcement agencies. One of the outputs of the global monitoring system is a series of global trend reports. The latest global trend report, which is also the second global trend report, focuses on the work of Brazil and South Africa, offering trend analysis of the illegal wildlife trade in these countries. What I would like to highlight today is that a large percentage of online illegal wildlife trade takes place on social media platforms. The data hubs in Brazil and South Africa detected hundreds of ads from May to July this year, of which 78% were on social media platforms and 22% on e-commerce platforms. Social media and online marketplaces have definitely made it easier for traffickers to advertise and sell protected species. Encrypted messaging apps and closed groups add an extra layer of difficulty for law enforcement and monitoring efforts. These activities often go unnoticed, especially when coded language and hashtags are used to evade detection. In terms of the findings from the global monitoring system, it's also interesting to note that social media websites are not only the main platform where online illegal wildlife trade is advertised, but the diversity of species advertised is much greater when compared to e-commerce platforms. We know that there is both a domestic demand and international demand for reptiles and plants. Plants are used for both ornamental aesthetics and traditional medicinal purposes. Reptile parts are also sold for their traditional medicinal purposes or turned into products such as jewelry, ornaments, shoes, belts, and handbags. Live reptiles are sold on the exotic pet trade. The international demand from Europe and the United States tends to be for exotic pets and ornamental plants, whereas demand from Asia is for use in traditional medicine and cultural beliefs, although the ornamental value of plants cannot be ignored, especially of orchids, succulents, and clivia. When it comes to online marketing, many ads are posted with photographs, prices, contact and location details. However, we are also seeing sellers who advertise products while live on social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram. There is also an increasing trend of offering protected species on a raffle, which means a number of tickets are sold to several interested buyers, and one winner will be chosen as the winner of the specimen. This shows the high demand of protected species, along with the high cost of obtaining such species. Speaking of high demand, there is an underestimated and unregulated market in South Africa for exotic pets, especially for live reptiles. Many exotic animals do not have legislation protecting or regulating their trade in the country. However, some of these species are CITES relevant and of conservation concern. Examples include Dumeral's boa and the Fiji banded iguana, which are listed on CITES Appendix 1, as well as caiman lizards, savanna monitor lizards, and yellow anacondas, which are listed on CITES Appendix 2. All of these species have been advertised online in South Africa in the past few months. We've also seen reptile species native to other countries that are not listed on CITES, but are being traded in South Africa, including the Sri Lankan pit viper and eyelash vipers native to Central America. Often these species will be imported into the country only to be re-exported on the global exotic pet trade. Whether reptiles and plants are traded domestically or internationally, they need to be packaged to evade detection, often in less than favorable conditions for the animals involved. Reptiles and plants are often concealed in personal luggage of travelers. Reptiles may be placed in containers or hidden within clothing or other items. For example, we've seen tortoises taped to prevent them from moving and hidden in socks. Reptiles and plants are often sent through postal or courier services. The first three photos from the left on the screen are from a seizure at Postnet, which is a retail courier company in South Africa. Multiple species, including sun gazer lizards and an African bullfrog, were packaged in plastic containers and boxes in an attempt to move them from Pretoria to Durban. Another tactic that is used is false declarations to pass off smuggled species as legally permissible items. The remaining photos on the slides include plants, which were packaged for exports as mushrooms at the top and as kids' toys at the bottom. When reptiles and plants are traded domestically, often the seller and buyer will meet in person to conclude the exchange, even if the sale was initiated online. At times, a delivery service or courier company will be used to transport the specimens. There are also large reptile expos and plant markets or fairs where sellers and buyers come together to trade. When reptiles are traded internationally, we see them leaving the country through Cape Town International Airport and OR Tambo International Airport, but also through Beitbridge, which is the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Succulents and other plants also exit through Cape Town and OR Tambo International Airports, but also through land borders to Mozambique and Namibia. To effectively disrupt these networks, a comprehensive response is needed that adapts to how traffickers blend digital and physical domains. Law enforcement efforts need to be as agile and interconnected as the criminal networks themselves. I'd like to share 2 case studies with you of successful prosecutions of reptile trafficking in the country. When it comes to reptile smuggling, German nationals play a large role, as Germany is a node of illegal reptile smuggling based on the large collectors culture in Germany. We've seen German nationals visit South Africa to pluck reptiles out of the wild and take home with them for their exclusive collections. But we've also seen German nationals who are part of organized crime networks, and it's often these organized crime networks that recruit South Africans to acquire the reptiles they need. Often, specific species are requested for a specific end user. These organized crime networks are not confined to South Africa and Germany, and often will see a much broader reach, extending, for example, into Japan, Mexico, and Costa Rica. The first case study is of a couple from Johannesburg who faced charges relating to the smuggling of reptiles from South Africa. In 2023, the husband was sentenced to a fine of 1 million rand, of which half was suspended for 5 years. The wife was sentenced to 5 years direct imprisonment, which was suspended for 5 years. The couple would wrap sun gazer lizards in teddy bears and send them via postal services with false sender information on the packages to avoid it being linked back to them. Ultimately, their involvement was determined through financial transactions and messages. Interestingly, the German nationals linked to the accused in this case had previously been convicted for smuggling lizards and other reptiles from South Africa. The case is a collaborative effort between the Environmental Enforcement Fusion Center and the Green Scorpions in implementing the National Integrated Strategy to Combat Wildlife Crime, and really targeted the value chain and financial crimes linked to illegal wildlife trade. The second case study is from earlier this month and involved a resident from right here in Cape Town. He faced 16 charges relating to illegal trafficking and possession of 56 protected species. He was handed down a 6-year custodial sentence and ordered to pay 100,000 rand. The imprisonment part of his sentence was suspended for 5 years. Most species were prohibited to be kept in captivity in the Western Cape and include, for example, Minshin vipers, which are listed on CITES Appendix 2, and indigenous wound spiders. Again, the accused in this case had links to German nationals who are known international reptile smugglers, and one of them had previously been convicted in the Northern Cape and in Gauteng on separate reptile smuggling cases. This case is the collaborative effort between Cape Nature, the South African Police Service Kales River Stock Theft Unit, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. To conclude the section on case studies, I'd like to offer a quote by Dr. Ashley Naidu from Cape Nature, who says case studies like the 2 I have presented are examples of the enforcement and prosecution success that we can obtain through provincial, national, and international collaboration across environmental law enforcement, criminal justice, and private sector role players. But I'd like to expand on this by emphasizing the importance of NGOs and civil society in collaborative efforts. We hope to see similar success stories through EcoSolve's data and information sharing and collaboration with law enforcement agencies, private sector partnerships, network and capacity building forums, and community engagement initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for providing me with this platform to share. If you found my presentation interesting, and I hope that you did, I'd like to encourage you to visit the EcoSolve website to see the data that the global monitoring system is collecting and to access the global trend reports, which will provide deep dive case studies from each of the countries that the project will cover.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and another round of applause for all of our 4 speakers. I think they were all excellent, and they helped us to paint a very comprehensive picture around the extent of what we're dealing with. We had top-down and bottom-up perspectives, more macro and more detailed perspectives as well, and I think we now can fully appreciate the extent of the problem and what we're dealing with, as well as have somewhat of a framework in mind to help move forward. With that in mind, we do have some time for discussion. I'm going to start with 2 online questions whilst you guys start thinking about your questions, and I'll look to take 2 at a time. If you can please introduce yourself, give your name, and then a short, sharp question, please, not long-winded comments, if that's okay. Okay, so we'll start with 2 questions online, and I'll address this to the full panel. So there's a question here from James Dart, who's particularly interested in Chinese transnational organized crime. He's asking if there are any documentation resources that you would refer him to further his knowledge. And then one from Amanda Cabrejo-Leroux. Madagascar was mentioned a few times. Could you recommend any reports or shed some light on the scale of trends in Madagascar? Any of the panelists wanna take a stab at that?
It's unfortunate that Dominique isn't here, so she'd be able to answer the question on Madagascar specifically. But we do know, sorry? Yeah, if David would like to give some insight on that, but we do know that a lot of those species have popped up on the online sites where South African plants are also being advertised. So David, if you can please shed some light on that.
Yes, thanks for the question. Well, look, when it comes to Madagascar, I think there are a lot of trade issues that are not only limited to succulent plants. I think the country experiences problems with fauna and flora at a big scale, and medicinal plants and access and benefit sharing. I think it's a very complex situation and one that isn't very well regulated in Madagascar. But certainly when it comes to succulent plants, I think for many years the country having so many endemic species, including some of the grapevine-like plants that Dominique pointed out, the cypher and so on, those have always been in demand and they continue to be so. So really I think a lot of emphasis needs to be put onto Madagascar and encouraging and assisting the government there to get on top of that. I mean, I'm not sure how much more detail we can go into, just to say that it's probably an understudied and under-remedied situation. I think there's a lot of mitigation required in Madagascar.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.
Sorry, just to add to that, I mean, in terms of reports, Amanda, there's also some reports that the Global Initiative did around trafficking tortoises in Madagascar, which ties in with some work that's been done on illicit flows of a range of commodities, including drugs and so on. So you can find that on the Global Initiative website, and I think there's some ENACT work as well that's looked at Madagascar.
Cool. Useful context. Does anybody have any comments on the China question? Or should we move to questions from the audience? See one hand up. Let's take two at a time. Lady in the white and then Vusi.
Thank you everyone for the presentations. My name is Intisar Fakir and I am with the Global Initiative Africa Advisory Board. I had a couple of questions for Melissa, but curious to hear anybody else's input on these. You mentioned use of AI, increased use of AI and technology. I was curious if you can give an example. Specifically, you said bridging the gap between data and implementation. I'd love to hear if you have any sort of detailed examples of that. And then the other question I had is in terms of, I think early on at the outset of your presentation, you mentioned one of the goals is to expose the corrupt relationship, some of the corrupt relationships. I was curious, what does that look like at the community level? Let me know if my questions are not clear. I'm happy to explain further what I mean. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to take that now whilst the mic goes on?
Okay, so addressing the first question on AI, you asked for a detailed example of what that looks like. We're in the process of developing that AI-enabled web scraper, so unfortunately I cannot give you a detailed example of that. But once it is implemented and we start using it, the methodology around it and the results will be available in one of the global trend reports. So we have about 8 of the global trend reports that will be coming out through the course of the project. The beginning section of the Global Trend Report really focuses on the methodology and what we've been finding, and thereafter it goes into deep dives in the countries mentioned in those reports. And then regarding the corrupt relationships and what that looks like at a community level, so I am not that clued up on that part of the project, so I can't give an in-depth answer on it. But what I can say is that there will be reports as well that are released, and I think that would tie in with the community level that you're asking about. But I also want to say that I'd like to take your contact details and get someone who is working on that section, get in contact with you to answer the questions that you have, if that's okay.
Lucy?
Thank you very much. My name is Sumsi Pikoli. I'm a member of the Advisory Board of ENACT, as well as a senior advisor to GI Talk and a member of the Africa Board of GI Talk. I also wish to really commend and appreciate, the work of the presenters and what they've presented. Perhaps to start with the role of EU and funding, ENACT. Perhaps there's more for the EU to do in terms of influencing European governments insofar as assisting us in Africa. They've got the European Parliament and you've got European nationals who are implicated. So we need to really, also, exchange views and find out as to how much they can be of assistance going beyond funding. I hope Lou is listening on this matter. Secondly, I like the impact statement. At times you normally have, the problem statement without an impact statement. And I think Karina has come up with something that's quite commendable. But also not just impact in terms of how it affects perhaps the victims and everybody else, but in terms of the impact of our responses insofar as reducing, the incidence of these issues. And then on the Malawian presentation, I wonder whether it would help, for instance, over and above the question of intelligence gathering and analysis, to adopt, a particular methodology. An example here in South Africa, I once had what was known as the Directorate of Special Operations, the Scorpions. They had, a unique methodology, that of intelligence-driven investigations and prosecution-led investigations. And that proved to be quite successful, ensuring that this multidisciplinary unit, operates as one and a single command. And that proved to be very effective. Also, I'm worried about the question of the provincial responses, which don't seem to be coordinated at a national level. That's something that perhaps we need to look at, because it's a national problem. It's not a provincial problem. All these resources belong to these countries. Therefore, our response should also be national. Therefore, we need to do something about that, which is also connected with the question of the misalignment of national legislation and provincial, legislation. Some of the things are really easy to do and to achieve, so that will really make an impact. Thank you, sir.
Cool. Thank you. Received comprehensive feedback. Okay, next set of questions. We've got Mark.
Mark Shaw from the GI. I wanted to ask two questions. First, there's several mentions of European nationals, Germany, a number of mention of German nationals, but when you look at the constellation of people who worked on responding to those cases, there isn't a mention of a German government entity. Do you know, was there cooperation with European partners, or was it very much driven here from South Africa? The second issue is, how do we make this more of a priority, given all that we are working on? I heard comments about crime, and perhaps that raises the priority, but it would be a priority that are focused on a range of times we are working.
Thanks. The panel, who wants to start?
So just on the first question about the law enforcement engagement with other countries. So in the first case study that I presented, there was collaboration with law enforcement in Germany and in Mexico, but the details of that is not really known. And then in the second case study, I know that there's collaboration with the Chinese officials, because it's found in a very endangered, and there's not many of them left. I think it's less than 200 that are left. So there is also collaboration to get the snakes that have been seized here back to China, and that is then collaboration between those countries, those law enforcements in those countries.
Just to add on that one, I think in the case of Malawi at the local level, I think we have law enforcement agencies working together through the interagency committee, which comprises of a number of law enforcement agencies like the police, the customs, the defense force, the National Intelligence Service, Financial Intelligence Authority, and other stakeholders, the judiciary included. So just to make sure that all the efforts are concerted. Thank you.
So I'll try and answer the question on a priority. I mean, that is a good question, and that is the challenge. I think there's sort of two sides on how to make these lesser known species, basically to make sure that people care about them. So the one side is the general public. I think there's a massive lack of awareness that these plants and reptiles even exist. I mean, I'm an organized crime researcher, and I had to work for a conservation entity before I found out the amazing variety of plants and species that occur in only a single place in South Africa. So if I didn't know that, and those are traded species, then I can assure you the public doesn't know that. So to this very day, it's been a year since my report's been published, and my friends are still surprised when I tell them that the Succulent Karoo is being emptied of endemic plants. So we really need to teach people and educate them, I think, about botany in general. We need to tell children that this is a potential career. You don't have to become a lawyer or an engineer. Like, there are really amazing jobs that are focused on biodiversity. So there's the sort of educating of the public, but I also think we should remember that it's a privilege to just enjoy nature and to not need to survive from it. It's something that I think that's where the real challenge lies. And then I've always gotten the idea that to make the plants, and I guess reptiles as well, a priority nationally, there's this feeling from the state that it needs to be in documents to be a priority. And it's such an issue to get it into those documents because it takes a long time and there's consultation. But we don't necessarily, I think, need to get them into a document to make sure that people realize they're important. So I think there's sort of two sides to the motivating them to be a priority. And then just on Vusi's point of the provincial versus national challenge, there are three people from Cape Nature. I don't know if you maybe wanted to comment on that. You don't have to, but if you would like to, you would be welcome.
Thank you. So we've got a hand in the back, a hand in the front. We'll do these two, and then we'll come to you and do another one after.
Good morning. I'm Albert from Cape Nature. I would like to respond on the question around the importance of the issue that we're currently facing. I can confirm that the issue of succulent poaching is a priority now at a national and provincial level. I regularly received responses of inquiries from the two different affairs of government. So therefore I can confirm. I mean, I'm sitting now as we speak. I need to respond tomorrow to the legislative around this. And the question which they also ask is, what is your needs? And yes, so I can confirm it gets the necessary attention at a high level.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Emily Kudza. I'll be your guide this afternoon. So I was employed by WWF through the Leslie Hill Succulent Karoo Trust to coordinate the National Response Strategic Plan. So it's been a whirlwind of things, starting when something has already begun in terms of the trade and everything and how to coordinate different agencies, national and NGOs. It has been a challenge, but working very closely with our nature conservation bodies, Cape Nature and Daryl, we've just started to have more cooperative and collaborative efforts to deal with the issues. So for example, with the monitoring in Objective 1, we've done countless monitoring to see what is actually in populations to update the national red list, the international red listing profiles. We've also managed to put some of these species on CITES. So within a year, we've done quite a bit. It's unfortunate that we can't show you all the progress that we've made, but it's little steps to a bigger goal. And I think since the beginning of the year, we've had the new minister come in, and as LB said, national government is now asking, okay, we had this national response strategic plan since 2022. What progress has been made? Why hasn't there been progress? And what are your needs? So now we are coordinating a joint effort to do like cabinet submissions to see what resources can be gathered to assist the various national conservation bodies and to also assist institutions such as SAMBI. But I also must admit that SAMBI is just a biodiversity institute. We rarely enforcement side. Later on that arrests have been made has led to so and there is a thing that people as of being
Thank you. I think the two.
Right, thank in the longer term. And of course, the short-term issues that we're facing, the ongoing poaching of plant material and how to deal with that. And I think one of the biggest issues for us is the short-term resources available to do this. It boils down to funding. You know, we have a wonderful strategic plan. I think WWF and SANBI did a great job on the plan, and I think we all know what the priorities are. But can we get the short-term funding to implement that? It's a real battle. And then the longer-term issues, and I'm just going to go through a few of the points that were raised earlier about the misalignment between national and provincial legislation. You know, this has been around for decades, but I think it sort of plays into the hands of criminal networks because they're able to trade with impunity, whereas people who try and do things legally are constrained by the law that controls them. And, well, I say constrained, maybe there are good reasons for that, but I think the nimbleness to which we're able to respond is constrained by that, by the legal system. And I think we need to look at that long and hard and find ways around that. Now, I mean, just one example is for all these plants that are being kept in nurseries at the moment, what on earth do you do with these? And I think one vision is, well, let's auction them off and make some profits for government agencies such as SANBI. But can that be done? I know it's been tried in similar resources such as abalone, but you end up running into difficulties with auctions like that where the people that are sometimes prosecuted for that end up buying it back, and there are complications around that. But if you're then going to sell them from, in other ways, how do you structure that business? And how do you let legitimate nurseries take it over, and how do you involve communities? So I think these are all complex issues that need to be solved so that you have a trading system that somehow overcomes the simplicity with which the illegal operators operate. And I think this is one of the biggest puzzles. You know, I think a formal succulent economy and how to set that up is a key issue. Look, I think the issue of, and maybe this is a question that I have for EcoSolve, which is to do with the web scrapers. And of course, it's really interesting to understand what goes on in the world, the online world. But maybe an issue that you're going to face sooner than later is that many of the websites that one wants to scrape from, of course, do not permit web scrapers to go on there. And so there's a legal constraint in terms of how you access this data. And I was wondering if you could answer, if you have some thoughts on how you deal with that situation of legally accessing websites to scrape the data. Thank you.
So again, just what I said earlier is that we're still developing the web scraper, and I'm not involved with the development. So I don't know if Julian wants to answer. Okay.
Thanks, David. Yeah, just to come in, Julian Rademeyer from Global Initiative. I think, obviously legal restrictions, previously was doing work as traffic, we went through, also similar kind of issues around collecting data. I think one of the key areas, and you've got to be cognizant of, restrictions on how sites can be scraped and invasions of privacy and so on, but the types of data that we're pursuing, at least in this early phase, are very much publicly available. They're published publicly on websites. We have in place, as do you, a relationship with the Department of Environmental Affairs, with alerting them to some of these ads. Essentially, we gather the information and we then provide an assessment of that information and pass it on. So it's not a case of scraping data illegally or digging, terribly deeply, but it's something that I think has to be guided by, a legal opinion as we go through. And I think what does make it quite complex is when you're investigating online trade, is that often it varies quite considerably from case to case. Where are things being posted? People using WeChat, or they're using, Signal, other encrypted messenger services, as opposed to your more public ones. And I think that makes it particularly challenging, as, for instance, work that's been done by some of the corporates to shut down ads on their websites, eBay and various others. That trade has gone further and further underground. And that, I think, in the long term is very much a real challenge. But it's also something where I think, new tools like artificial intelligence can really play an enormous role in sifting through huge amounts of data and going far beyond the kind of web scraping tools that we all use today.
I'm Aaron Heyman. I'm an analyst with the Global Initiative. I just had one question that popped up. I think it was on your 7th point, Karina, in your presentation, but it has to do with the succulent species. If these species of plants are purely ornamental in use, I mean, would it not be is there not an opportunity, maybe outside of the protected areas, for communities to get involved in cultivating these plants in the natural environment, and then to sell it on the formal market? I mean, it seems logical to do just that, and maybe just have a lot more species out there to sell to the foreign market.
Thanks, Aaron. So that was something that was discussed at the formal economy workshop that was co-hosted with Sanby. But so as I've also mentioned, the WWF did a study on the different kinds of nursery models that could potentially produce, more species legally. And that study showed what other studies have also showed, that community sort of nursery setups very seldomly work, because people underestimate the resources that are needed. So the amount of sort of startup capital that goes into starting something from scratch, as well as maintaining that and then making sure that those plants have access and facilities to end up at the market. So they did a study on different sort of nursery models. So yes, in theory, that is the whole plan, is to make sure that the benefits accrue to the communities. But in terms of what will actually work, we're not sure what the right model is yet. The feeling from the people at the workshop, if I recall correctly, was that, we can, as David have mentioned, potentially provide nurseries with these seed plants, even if it's just as mother plants. But the demand also changes. And so you can perhaps flood the market with those plants, regardless of who supplies them, but that demand will eventually wane. And if that happens, what happens to the community nursery, for example? So yeah, the legal market as a way to counter the illegal market is quite challenging to figure out, because there's a lot to consider. But so it has been considered. I don't know if Sanby Emily, is there a publicly available document on the outcomes of the workshop?
Julian, you wanted to say something, and then gentleman behind you.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to respond. There was a question earlier about EcoSolve and some of the work that's being done. So I think the main premise behind the EcoSolve project, which I'm involved in supporting, my colleague Louise, who's heading it, is online at the moment, is it's intended to develop innovative responses, bring in technology, artificial intelligence, but more than that, it's also to bring in and build capacity, build community responses. So there's a grants program which supports community action. It also supports work that can help better improve efforts to combat wildlife trafficking and online trade. I think there's also another element of the project which is an expose element, which is to look at your corporate elites that are involved in trafficking of timber, for instance, political groupings or people that are involved, and then exposing those actors. But very much, I think the community side of things is important because it's often been a very neglected area of law enforcement responses. And we see it all the time in South Africa, for instance, where it's very much a boots on the ground law enforcement response. And the communities eventually become alienated and left out of the processes. So I think, for instance, what Karina was talking about earlier about building community responses into strategic responses is very important. So those are some of the things that EcoSolve is working on.
Thanks for the perspective. As a gentleman behind you wants to ask a question.
Okay, Leon Miller, Cape Nature. Just on the question of the specific plants and the cultivating on taking it to the community. The problem is because of it being specifically targeted as a collectible item by your overseas, the overseas demand is specifically for the specific characters of a wild plant. He doesn't want a cultivated plant that he can buy anywhere. He wants to brag to be in possession of a 300-year-old plant that has typically natural characteristics of it being grown. And that is what makes it difficult. Yes, you can have the communities cultivate the things, but that is not what the market is looking for. And that is the biggest problem.
Thank you. Any final questions? Going once, going twice. Cool. So I think we'll break for coffee now, but before we do, if you can fill out the evaluation forms, they should, for the people in the room, be on your tables, and I think virtually you can access the QR code. If I'm not, yeah, it should pop up. So thank you again to all of our panelists for their insights, very comprehensive, and I think we've gotten a really, really good perspective on how to deal with trafficking of plants and reptiles and wildlife in the Southern African region. We'll break for coffee. I'm sure there are a lot of ideas floating around, so you can chat to the panelists and take the conversation further. Thank you again to ENACT and to all the partners for hosting us. Great session. Thank you.